Modern British cooking tells you to buy fresh stock from the shop. Your nan made it from scraps. We throw away vegetable water. She turned it into a soup base. We struggle with sticky eggshells. She added one ingredient to the pot and they slid right off. The gap between what we know and what she knows is bigger than you think. And it's costing us flavor. Let's start with the most iconic one. That jar was sitting on every British stove in the 1950s. Number 1. Saving and reusing cooking fats. In 1950s kitchens, nothing was wasted. Not even bacon or beef drippings. They were poured into jars and reused to fry vegetables, roast potatoes, or spread on toast. It wasn't just thrift, it was flavor. That jar on the stove? It was the secret behind why Nan's Sunday dinner always tasted better than yours. Number 2. Spreading dripping on toast. In 1950s Britain, kids happily ate beef or bacon fat spread on bread called dripping toast or a piece and dripping. Sprinkle a little salt and that was lunch. It was rich, savory and full of Sunday roast flavor. Frugal, yes, but also deeply loved, a taste now nearly vanished from modern life. Number 3. Finish cooking in a haybox or cozy. To save gas or coal, cooks use the old heat retention method. Bring a stew or pudding to the boil, then turn it off and wrap the pot in a thick, insulated container. In practice, they might use a homemade haybox, an old gas mask carrier filled with straw or hay, or simply wrap the pot in blankets and old rugs. The retained heat would carry on cooking the food gently for hours, using virtually no fuel. Number 4. Whip an eggless salad dressing. Instead of egg-based mayonnaise or creamy dressing, one could whip up a dressing with evaporated milk. For instance, chilled tinned milk could be beaten to a froth, then slowly beaten together with oil, vinegar, or lemon juice and mustard to make a creamy dressing. This simple dressing was used on salads or cold vegetables when eggs were not available. Number 5. Soak dried pulses and oats overnight. Beans, peas, and oatmeal were staple, inexpensive foods. By soaking them in water, often with a pinch of salt, overnight, or for a few hours, housewives cut the later cooking time by half. This saved both fuel and made the legumes cook evenly for soups and stews. Number 6. Malt vinegar. In post-war Britain, cheaper cuts like shin, brisket, or scrag end were standard in working-class kitchens. To tenderize these tougher meats, home cooks added a tablespoon of malt vinegar to the pot whilst stewing. The mild acidity broke down the connective tissue during cooking, making even the cheapest cuts soft and flavorful. The technique faded as better cuts became affordable, but it's still brilliant for making budget meat taste like Sunday dinner. Number 7. Keeping fresh herbs cool and accessible. Before plastic containers and clamshells existed in every shop, housewives had simpler storage tricks that worked just as well. Wash and dry parsley thoroughly. Wrap it tightly in foil, then keep it in the fridge. When you need some, just snip off what you want with scissors and re-wrap the rest for next time. Another method that worked brilliantly? Place washed mint or parsley stems, still slightly damp, in a glass jar with the lid screwed on tight. It stays green and fresh for 2 weeks or more. Number 8. Defrosting meat in an enamel bowl with warm, salted water. Back in 1950s Britain, freezers were rare. But by the late decades, small fridge units were becoming more common, and so was frozen meat. When cooks needed to speed up defrosting, especially on busy weekday mornings, one smart method was to place the wrapped chicken or beef into an enamel or ceramic bowl filled with warm, lightly salted water. The salt slightly lowered the water's freezing point and conducted heat more efficiently than plain water, helping meat thaw faster without cooking the outer layer. It was quicker than just leaving it on the counter and safer than exposing it directly to hot water. Some added a metal spoon or fork into the bowl to draw warmth deeper into the meat. A quiet trick based on conductive heat. While modern kitchens rely on microwaves, this vintage method is still safer, gentler, and surprisingly effective, especially when you're in a rush but don't want rubbery edges. Number 9. Using a potato ricer for silky mash. For perfectly smooth, lump-free mashed potatoes that feel like silk on your tongue, many 1950s cooks used a potato ricer or food mill instead of a hand masher. The difference is remarkable. The fine consistency of riced potatoes absorbs butter and cream beautifully, yielding a velvety mash that's almost fluffy. It's actually less effort than mashing by hand, and the results are consistently better every single time. Number 10. Parboiling and roughing up roast potatoes. The classic British Sunday roast demanded ultra-crisp roast potatoes. Not just browned, properly crispy with edges that shatter when you bite them. Here's exactly how they did it and why it works so well. Parboil peeled potato chunks in salted water until just tender, almost falling apart. Drain them thoroughly in a colander. Then toss them hard in the pot or shake the colander to roughen the edges and create a floury coating on the outside. Finally, roast them in very hot fat, traditionally beef dripping or goose fat, until deeply golden and crispy. Those craggy, roughed-up edges yield a super crispy exterior whilst the insides stay fluffy and soft. This technique was likely part of 1950s cooking lore, even if it wasn't formally written down in books. It was just what you did if you wanted proper roast potatoes. It's how you achieve authentic crunch that modern recipes calling for olive oil simply cannot replicate. Number 11. Resting meat under an upturned bowl. In the 50s, especially in modest kitchens without warming drawers or fancy carving stations, cooks knew that letting roasted meat rest before carving made all the difference. But instead of foil or oven-proof dishes, many simply placed an upturned ceramic mixing bowl over the roast on the countertop. This trick kept the joint warm while preventing it from steaming too much, helping juices settle rather than leak out onto the board. Resting made meat more tender, easier to carve, and far juicier, especially important when every slice counted. It was a quiet, intuitive move passed down in homes, not cookbooks. And today, this simple method still works like magic with roasts or even pan-fried steaks. Trap warmth without trapping steam, and your meat turns out better every time. Number 12. Cracking eggs with a spoon for neater poaching. In the 50s, British kitchens where poached eggs were a beloved part of breakfast or high tea, home cooks had their own clever methods for success without fancy gadgets or ring molds. One such trick was this. Instead of cracking an egg straight into boiling water, which could cause messy white tendrils floating everywhere, they'd first gently crack it into a teacup or ladle using the back of a spoon. Then they'd lower the cup just above the water's surface and slip the egg in smoothly. This gentle entry helped the white wrap neatly around the yolk without breaking apart or spreading out across the pan. Some cooks even added a splash of vinegar to the water to help the egg hold together, a tip passed around quietly in community cookbooks and church recipe collections. Number 13. Adding salt to boiled eggs for easy peeling. There was another version of this trick that worked just as well. Add a couple of tablespoons of salt to the pot of cold water covering the eggs, then bring it to the boil and let them sit off heat until completely cool. The salt aids the separation of shell and egg white, working on the same principle as the baking soda method, but with a slightly different chemistry. This simple adjustment, grounded in vintage practice, saves time and prevents wasted egg white when making deviled eggs or egg salad for sandwiches. Both methods work. Both were used. People just chose whichever one they'd learned from their own mothers and stuck with it. Number 14. Setting sauces with gelatine. Gelatine was far more common in the 1950s kitchens than it is today. It wasn't just for making wobbly desserts. Cooks added unflavored gelatine to sauces and leftovers to create rich aspics or to thicken and stabilize cream sauces that would otherwise separate or weep. A dash of gelatine, or even a whisk of softened jelly, can add body and shine to a sauce in a way that corn flour or plain flour cannot. Number 15. Dotting butter to stop jams and syrups foaming. When cooking down fruit to make jam or syrup, the surface would bubble and foam endlessly. You'd have to stand there skimming it off over and over, wasting time and losing precious jam in the process. 1950s cooks figured out that adding a small amount of butter worked as a defoamer. Just a knob, nothing more. The fat breaks the surface tension, so a clear, deep-colored conserve or syrup forms without all that hassle. You can use this in any simmering sauce or preserve today to keep it smooth and maximize your yield. It's a tiny adjustment that saves minutes of tedious work and means more jam in the jar at the end. Number 16. Preventing pie crust blisters with a counterweight. Home pie making was everywhere in the 1950s. Meat pies, fruit pies, savory tarts. Everyone was making them. But pastry had a frustrating habit of puffing up in the oven, creating air pockets that made the filling slide around or the crust crack. Here's a clever tip to keep pastry from doing that. After rolling and fitting your crust into the tin, prick it all over with a fork to let steam escape. Then place a second pie tin or heat-proof dish of the same size directly on top before baking. This metal lid holds the crust perfectly flat whilst it bakes, so it comes out smooth and even without any bubbles or blisters. Many cooks used spare tins or baking beans as weights for blind-baked pastry, but the second tin method was simpler and faster. Today, this old trick still works brilliantly. A weighted crust means no soggy bottom and no air pockets lurking under your filling, waiting to ruin everything when you slice it. Number 17. Baking fruit butters and jams in the oven. Before electric mixers and precise stovetop controls made everything easier, some cooks slow-cooked their preserves in the oven instead of on the hob. To make apple butter or fruit jelly without standing over it stirring constantly for hours, you'd mix everything in a heavy pan and bake the mixture in a low oven. The gentle, even heat eliminates the constant, tedious stirring and prevents the bottom from catching and burning, yielding a jam that sets evenly and tastes cleaner. This method reflects 1950s thrift and patience. You couldn't just walk away from a pot on the stove, but you could put something in the oven and get on with other work. It's still convenient today. Use a low oven, around 120 to 140 degrees Celsius, and a heavy pan with the lid slightly ajar to let steam escape. The jam quietly does its work whilst you attend to other tasks, and you come back hours later to perfect preserves. Number 18. Adding a knob of butter at the end to round out sauces. In many 1950s British kitchens, once a stew or gravy had simmered down, the final flourish was a simple but powerful one. A small knob of butter stirred in just before serving, not for richness alone, but for shine, smoothness, and balance. This finishing touch mellowed acidity, softened harsh spices, and gave sauces a silky, velvety texture. Some cooks even swirled it into soups or mashed vegetables for a touch of gloss and warmth. It was an intuitive act, more about feel than measurement, and it turned everyday meals into something that felt just a bit more comforting. Even today, this trick is used by chefs to mount with butter, but it's pure 1950s practicality. Number 19. Making puddings from leftover bread and cake. In 1950s, British kitchens throwing away food was practically unthinkable. Even bread that had gone stale or cake that had dried out wasn't destined for the bin. Instead, these leftovers became the foundation for beloved desserts that families looked forward to. Old white bread, sponge cake that had been sitting too long, even biscuits that had lost their snap, all found new life in pudding bowls across the country. Bread and butter pudding was a classic example. Stale sliced bread, buttered and layered with sultanas, then soaked in custard and baked until golden. The dried-out texture actually worked better than fresh bread because it absorbed the custard without turning to mush. Fruit trifles relied on the same principle. Leftover sponge cake, cut into chunks and soaked in jelly or sherry, formed the base layer before custard and cream went on top. The cake didn't need to be fresh. In fact, day-old sponge held its shape better when it got soaked. Number 20. Fluffing omelettes with baking powder. Vintage cookbooks even had suggestions for making omelettes lighter and more impressive. One 1950s tip advises whisking about a quarter teaspoon of baking powder into 4 beaten eggs before cooking them in the pan. The resulting omelette is considerably lighter, more attractive with its puffy appearance, and tastes better because the texture is so much softer. This old-school hack was common before modern egg beaters and whisks made it easy to incorporate air manually. The baking powder does the work chemically instead. Today's home cooks can try it for a pillow-soft omelette or frittata that rises beautifully in the pan. A tiny nod to mid-century innovation that most people have completely forgotten about. Number 21. Wrap pots in cloth. Cozy cooking. In lieu of continuous heating, a partially cooked pot could be wrapped snugly to finish itself. A hot pot of vegetables or oatmeal, once taken off the stove, would be packed into thick blankets, old carpets, or even padded tea cozies, so the retained heat continued the cooking. This cozy method prevented heat loss and saved fuel. Number 22. Before food processors or even reliable hand mixers were common in 1950s Britain, home bakers knew the key to perfect short crust pastry was cold hands and a light touch. They would rub in lard, dripping, or margarine using just their fingertips, not their palms. This kept the fat cool and prevented it from melting into the flour too quickly. Warm hands could ruin a crust by making it greasy or tough. It was a small, skillful gesture that made all the difference, and one that's still just as useful today. Number 23. Juicing lemons with a fork to avoid waste. When a recipe needed only a small amount of lemon juice, 1950s cooks had a clever solution. Rather than cutting the lemon in half and exposing the entire cut surface to air, they'd pierce it with a fork and squeeze out just what they needed. This method let you extract a few tablespoons of juice whilst keeping the rest of the fruit intact and fresh. It's a small but practical trick born from rationing times, when lemons were expensive and you couldn't afford to waste any. By keeping most of the lemons sealed, you could store it for days and come back to it later without it drying out or going moldy. Today, you can still use this technique when you need just a splash of lemon for a pan of greens, over grilled fish, or to brighten a sauce, all without dragging out a juicer or creating a sticky mess on the counter. Number 24. Using fruit to lift savory dishes. Even when cooking savory meals, 1950s cooks would add a touch of sharp or sweet fruit to boost both flavor and color. Cooking apples with a handful of cranberries, for instance, creates a sauce that's tangier and more vibrant than relying on cinnamon alone. The cranberries contribute a deeper, brighter red that makes the dish look more appealing on the plate. Modern cooks can revive this tradition easily. Toss fresh berries into a pan sauce whilst it reduces. Stir a spoonful of chutney into a casserole. Whisk marmalade into gravy for a complexity that's subtle but noticeable. The fruit adds layers of flavor that make people wonder what your secret ingredient is, even though it's something simple sitting in the cupboard. Number 25. Lining baking tins with cabbage leaves. In resourceful 1950s kitchens, particularly when making savory dishes like meatloaf, suet puddings, or steamed pies, cooks would line their tins or pudding basins with large outer cabbage leaves. This simple step stopped food from sticking to the metal, made washing up considerably easier, and gave the dish a subtle, earthy aroma as it cooked. It was especially useful during times when greaseproof paper wasn't affordable or readily available in every household. The cabbage leaf worked like a natural non-stick layer, protecting the food and the tin at the same time. In some cases, once the dish was cooked, you could even eat the softened cabbage leaf along with everything else, meaning truly nothing went to waste. It's a clever, sustainable trick that's almost completely disappeared from modern kitchens, yet it still works beautifully for rustic bakes and traditional steamed puddings. If you're making something in the old style, try it. You'll find the cabbage does exactly what expensive baking parchment does, but it costs nearly nothing and adds a bit of flavor too. So here's the strange part. We've spent decades convinced that cooking has gotten better. Better ingredients, better equipment, better knowledge. But your nan, working in a tiny kitchen with rationed meat and a jar of dripping, was pulling off things we can't replicate today. The recipes are still there, sitting in drawers, written on cards, printed in books that smell like dust. And some of them, the really good ones, are making their way back. Chefs are rediscovering beef dripping. Food bloggers are posting about thick omelets done with baking powder. But most of these tricks? Still buried, still waiting. Your nan's kitchen was more advanced than you thought. The question is, how much more is still hidden in there? If you liked and enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button.